Today we're connecting with Willa Liburd Tavernier. Willa hails from our Twin Island Federation. She is currently a research impact and open scholarship librarian at Indiana University. And recently, Willa spearheaded the launch of an open source digital resource collection called Land, Wealth, Liberation. Well, let's find out more about that. Willa, good morning and welcome
Good morning,
to Good Morning,
welcome.
Oh, I love the way that you said that. We're gonna find a use for that, definitely, indeed. So let's talk about that project that I just mentioned. It seems so involved, and I imagine that because of its title, it must have struck a chord with you, perhaps even in more than one way. So, what inspired you to pursue that project?
Well, the inspiration or the rationale behind it was really to foster intercultural understanding. And if we're to have intercultural understanding, you first need to have understanding. And to have that, people need information. So whether the information we provide changes someone's perspective is often outside of the control of information workers like us who work in libraries, archives, and museums and heritage sites. But we were hoping to present this information in such a way that it would engage people in the general public and also encourage them to ask questions about society, because misinformation is a big problem that we have right now. When the episodes of racial unrest broke out across the US in 2020, it was clear that there was a lot of misinformation that people were operating under insofar as what really happens when people from non-white communities encounter institutions such as the police or businesses. And there's a lot of history behind that. But the history is not well known because in the US, information on Black communities and their history is marginalized and sometimes excluded completely in the K-12 curriculum, in university research, in library collections, and even in the built environment. When we're talking about heritage sites or tourism sites, a lot of that history is suppressed. And because a significant number of the population just doesn't have this understanding, there's a certain dehumanization that takes place in relation to people from non-white communities, but especially Black communities. So by telling these stories of Black communities and the various struggles that they went through, we're trying to challenge existing narratives about race, center the humanity of people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people, and shine a light on the impacts of systemic racism alongside other forms of oppression, and lift up the universal benefits of racial justice. And, you know, right now, a lot of what is focusing our attention is, you know, the Russia and Ukraine war. But even in the early reporting on that, you saw well-educated people, trained journalists really making ignorant statements about the cultures of non-European countries. And I won't dig into that, but it just shows how far misinformation and a lack of information can go in terms of its impact on people and how people respond to members of one community versus members of another community.
Oh, very good reasons indeed. Well,
So can you tell us why the name?
Well, when we started doing the research, we were looking at Black Wall Streets.
Okay.
And the story started to tell itself as we looked at various communities that were financially prosperous or centers of Black business life. And the story that came out through the research was really that you had people working hard to be self-sufficient, to build their own wealth, to build strong communities, even though they were segregated from the wider communities. And time after time, there were incidents that hampered their progress. So this can range from outright violence by mobs to government policies. And so what came out from the research was really the making and unmaking of Black wealth in America.
All right, so you gave us an overview, I would say, of some of the stories, but we're talking about, I guess, a collection of stories as well. Was there a particular story, or were there any particular stories that resonated with you as a librarian?
I think the one example that resonated with me the most was the story of Rosewood, Florida. And that was a community where it was not completely, but almost all Black. You had quite a number of businesses, and the violence erupted after a housewife accused an unnamed Black man of breaking into her house and attacking her, and which was never proven. And Rosewood is actually a case in which the state of Florida eventually paid reparations to the victims in the 1980s for this violence that happened in the 1920s. What really struck me about Rosewood is that just on, and this came up in a lot of the stories, just on one person say so, or because of sensationalized accounts in the media, you had a mob attacking an entire town and just burning it to the ground. And the residents, some of them tried to make a stand. Most of them hid in the swamps. And if you know about Florida and South and like the swamp areas, they have a lot of crocodiles and stuff. So just imagine people, children hiding in the swamps, trying to stay out of sight. And what struck me were two incidents where I would say three incidents where they received help. So one was a businessman. He was white, one of the few whites in the town, who, even though he was threatened, he took the children, as much children as he could find, he and his wife, and kept them in their house to keep them safe, because the mob would not attack a white home. And then there were two brothers who conducted a railroad, and the primary source accounts relate that they knew the names, they knew everybody in the town. And what they did is they drove their train up the tracks very, very slowly, blowing their horn and shouting for the people to come out of the swamps so that they could get them to safety. And so they took all the women and children up to Gainesville, where the Black community of Gainesville then took them in. And it stood out because it was clear that these people who took these actions, they were white just like the people in the mobs were white. But what stood out is that they clearly knew the people in the town. They had relationships with them, they knew them well, and they saw them not as separate and apart, but as belonging to, the same community. And so when they even at danger to themselves, because the mob could have attacked the train and could have attacked the homes, they still reached out to help where help was needed.
That to me
the
will
survivors
represent.
actually took an oath of silence that was only broken because of investigative journalism in the late 70s and 80s, where they agreed to tell their stories, and the state of Florida paid reparations to the survivors and their descendants.
Have you ever experienced any discrimination whilst living abroad?
Well, the thing is that even if people are not personally prejudiced, it affects all of us. And I'll share two things. I have two boys. They're in the primary school system here. The first year we were here, in math class, my older son was paired with another student. They work in pairs. And that student said to him that they couldn't be partners because a white person can't be partners with a black person. And so when he came from home from school and he told me, and I asked him, did he tell the teacher? And he said yes, and I asked what the teacher did, and he said that she reassigned him. And I waited for a week to see if the school would reach out to me, you know, telling myself, Willa, you can't go up there and cuss out the people. So let's see if somebody says something. And they didn't say anything. So I reached out to the classroom teacher. And, you know, they had some sort of intervention with the young man and his parents. And the teacher came back, the classroom teacher, not the mathematics teacher, came back and told me, you know, he just doesn't seem to get it. He's the other child. He said it as a joke. He didn't mean to hurt anybody. We just don't seem to be able to get through to him why this is inappropriate and not funny. And, you know, I'm happy to say that the school really, I mean, not my incident alone, there were other children who had incidents. And the school really, over the past couple of years, have taken a deep dive into learning how to deal with problems like that, getting training from people and organizations that know how to handle those sorts of things, and also how you build an intercultural classroom rather than telling only the stories of one group of people in America. And, you know, also I live in southern Indiana, and this is a place where historically the Ku Klux Klan has been very active. They have, you know, recruited on campus. They've, you know, put flyers about the place. I've worked the reference desk where a patron called me in tears looking for some information about a murder that took place a few years ago of an Asian student who had been killed by some white nationalist terrorist, I guess. So even if something, you know, me not having grown up in this system with race, having to deal with racism, is not some sort of automatic protection from it. I think once you're here, you can be affected by it, whether directly or indirectly.
Okay. And that's a very solid point, because when I listened to you before, I was thinking, when we hear about social injustice and racial discrimination and racial injustice in America, I generally think of, well, those are Black Americans, but I've never actually gotten to the point of thinking there are migrants or immigrants, people from the Caribbean who are part of that culture now and obviously have to face some of those fears as well. And when you spoke earlier, it did resonate with me, Willa, and having the thought of you to explain what racism is to your young boy in that way, it says to me that your work is so very important. So let's continue to talk about your work, the fact that it is an online digital resource, the fact that it is, I would assume by that very nature, accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so it is a digital online resource, and it's anyone anywhere in the world who has an internet connection can connect. And something you said just now resonated with me, because I also, most of my friends are still back in the West Indies, and a lot of the times there is a lack of understanding of Black America, because also we don't have the information, we don't understand what challenges they faced historically, because we people like me who grew up in the 80s, where, you know, our parents and our grandparents kind of went through the struggle, and we were able to grow up in a less prejudiced, though not perfect society. Oftentimes we have blinders on because there's a lot that we can deal with that we won't take offense at. You know, people say strippiness, you know, it's not personal because you have confidence. You don't have, it never occurs to you that you might not be able to do something because of your skin color, because you grew up in a situation where everybody, well, not everybody, but many people, or the great majority, look like you. So your doctors and your lawyers and the leaders of your country and your scholars, they all look like you. So you don't have this lack of confidence that you can do something or that you belong in a particular place, but it's a different, it's the Black American experience is different. So I was really interested in making this accessible. And basically, it's a digital scholarly resource. And what we do there is we apply computer-based techniques to a particular area of study to gain insights that you would not be able to see without using those techniques. So this digital storytelling that pulls all of these stories together, and we present it in a timeline format. It helps you to see a pattern, right? It's not just, well, there was this one thing that happened over the break. We were talking about Tulsa. A lot of people know about Tulsa, not everybody, but it is the most widely known sort of Black financial district that was destroyed, but I don't know that there were so many more. And when you start to string these together on a timeline and you see what was happening, okay, this happened in the 1860s and the 1870s and the 1890s and the 1900s and the 1920s and the 1930s over and over and over again, then you get to see the true impact. And even though the information is out there in the scholarly work, it's presented in a different way when you apply these digital techniques, and it's also presented in a way that the layman can understand. We use minimal computing techniques. We don't use very complex techniques, even though those are available to us. And I've used them in other research. We used a low computing approach, so really that we could build this digital resource collaboratively with student workers and make it easy to maintain as well, and not use up, because when you use a lot of complex computing techniques, it takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of power, takes a lot of hardware and software. We wanted a minimalist approach, both so that our students could grasp the methods and develop those skills as an entry point into digital skills, and presenting it in a way that's easily understood by the general public. Okay. So there's a timeline of events, as I mentioned. There's also stories about specific communities and specific people, and then there's lesson plans that explore how Black communities were affected by the rule of law or the absence of the rule of law. And each of these is supported by references to reliable information, scholarly articles, investigative journalism, and archival sources that the great majority of these you can click through and read the full text of those underlying sources. And this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of misinformation online. It's really easy for someone to make a video, post it on YouTube or TikTok without referencing any sources whatsoever for the information, right, but people believe it.
And I like the fact that you are there. I hate to jump in, Willa, but we are actually pressed for time. And you've actually, yes, the work that you have you've been talking about is very important, but I don't want that to be the only thing we talk about, because we have you here and you are actually an author as well. We want to talk about your book, Pink is for Boys. Interesting title. What can you tell us about the title and the book?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Pink is for Boys is a little book I wrote that was based on interactions with my older son and my best friend's older daughter. And it was really interesting to see how children get gender stereotypes, even if we don't say things explicitly to them, or even if we think we're actively working against these stereotypes. They're out there in the society. And I don't think that we should put that sort of pressure on young people. I mean, you're going to exclude a whole half of the population from wearing a certain color or doing a certain activity. We shouldn't put those limits on children. And I found it interesting, and I found the ways that we each dealt with it in talking to the children interesting in terms of how you resolve conflict, that you can disagree but stay calm. So I wrote the story down based on those experiences all the way back in 2017. I actually got the publishing done during pandemic times when we were all sent home and working from home. Now and again there was a lull, and I was able to find an illustrator who's from Haiti, and so I was very happy to work with another Caribbean person. And I've had really good response to the book so far.
Great, congratulations on that. Pink is for boys, definitely something to check out. Willa, I wish we had more time to talk, but you know what? The information that you shared today is definitely enlightening. Your personal experiences, the things that you took away, and the things that we are able to take away because of our time with you today.
If you could just grant me the opportunity to just say one more thing, that I still think Caribbean countries can learn from the experiences of Black America. I think learning from other societies is really important when we start talking about wealth and poverty, because what was happening here is that a lot of the times the government policies deliberately created an environment where people could not thrive. And, you know, they made a lot of people dependent on welfare and handouts. And it was really about class, because it wasn't just Black people. It was people of all races, including white people, that they considered undesirable. And it's a structure that's designed to keep majority of people poor and grateful for you on handouts. So when we as countries are thinking about how we build our poverty reduction strategy, we have to think about whether we're investing in a climate where people can thrive, or if we're making people dependent on handouts. And help and assistance is great if it's part of a wider policy that enables people to thrive. But if it's not great, if it's going to just keep people in the same position all the time and hoard all the opportunities and all the wealth to as one set of people rather than advancing society as a whole. So there's still a lot to be learned from intercultural exchange.